Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about writing to evaluate or evaluative writing. So what is evaluation? Well, when you evaluate something, you're making a well-reasoned conclusion about the worth or the quality or the value of a subject, right? You can also think of it as a judgment about the quality of something or someone based on appropriate criteria. So the word I want to emphasize here is judgment. Right? So if you go to the movies, right, you often decide whether a movie or a film was worth seeing, right? If you listen to a new song, you make a judgment about whether or not it was worth listening to, right? If you go to a restaurant, you decide, okay, was this a quality restaurant? Would I come back again? Was it worth eating at, right? So those are the sort of things that we do when we write to evaluate. Okay, so evaluations are something we do, every day. So if you've ever written a film review, you've done an evaluation, right? If you've ever written a book review, if you've ever done a teacher evaluation, or if you've gone to Rate My Professor and evaluated a teacher, you're doing the work of evaluation. Amazon posts, restaurant reviews, these are all types of evaluative writing. Okay, so in speaking, we're often making judgments, right? We go to a restaurant, it's like, okay, this food is awful. If we go to a movie, this movie sucks, right? But when we're thinking about writing to evaluate or doing an academic evaluation, you really want to develop your position or your judgment about someone or something, right? Getting into why you have that judgment, right? So if I decided, you know what, this restaurant I went to, it's worth going to. It was awesome. It was something everyone in the community should visit at least once. Well, then in my body paragraphs, I would get into why that is. So I might talk about the food, right? And I would describe the food maybe in a paragraph or two. I might talk about the cleanliness of the restaurant. I might talk about the service, right? So these would all be subpoints that I would develop in my body paragraphs to illustrate why I had come to that conclusion, right? Another point that I want to bring up is, often evaluations are mixed, right? So we might feel like a restaurant was great, but the bathrooms were kind of dirty, right? And so we have a lot of positive things to say, but we might have a paragraph that's sort of negative. And that's totally fine, right? In your thesis, you would want to say that. You would want to say, if it were a restaurant review, for example, you'd want to say, even though the bathrooms were a bit messy, ultimately the restaurant was wonderful, right? So notice how I'm acknowledging the negative while focusing on the positive, and just know that that's totally acceptable and often common in evaluative writing. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about criteria, and I think this is really important when we're talking about academic evaluations, right? So criteria are our standards or our principles or factors that we decide or that we use to reach an objective judgment. So if I just went into a restaurant and sort of had my felt or I had an opinion about the restaurant, that's totally valid, but I might not understand what my criteria are for evaluating the restaurant. So when we're thinking about a formal evaluation, you want to think about the standards or principles or guidelines that you're going to use to make that judgment. So if I were going to a restaurant to do a formal restaurant review, I'd want to think about my standards. So I might need to say, you know what, the service better be appropriate and customer friendly, right? I might say, okay, the food needs to taste good. I might say it needs to be clean, right? These are my expectations. These are my standards. In our class, I use a rubric, right, as my criteria for making decisions about your writing. If I told you, oh, I just felt like this was a C, I just felt like this was a B, you might not appreciate that. You might ask me, but what are you basing this on? Well, I would if I were doing a proper evaluation of your essay, I would want to pull out my rubric and I would want to show you on the rubric why you had earned that C, right? So think of criteria as sort of your rubric or your standards or principles that you're going to use to make an informed and well-reasoned conclusion or judgment. Okay, so I'd like to look at just a sample paragraph from an evaluation, and this is actually from a student. A student wrote this, a former student wrote this, and we had watched a lecture by the author Michael Pollan, who's a sort of a famous food writer who is also a lecturer at UC Berkeley. And I assigned an evaluation of his speech. So essentially the question was, is the speech worth watching? If so, why? If not, why not? So this was a body paragraph that the student wrote. And as we're reading this, you might think about, well, what criteria is this paragraph anchored to? Or what is basing the point that the student makes about Michael Pollan? Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. And I encourage you to read this closely. Okay. So the student says, the location where Michael Pollan is speaking also adds value to Pollan's speech. In fact, the speech was done at the campus of Stanford University, a institution, that should be an institution, by the way, but small misstep. Anyway, a institution known for its sophistication and research. If Pollan had been speaking on a random street corner, then his points might have seemed less important. However, the fact that he gave his speech at one of the most prominent universities in America is one of the many points that indicates the value of Pollan's talk. So ask yourself, what seems to be the focus? What subpoint about Michael Pollan's speech is he focusing on to form his overall judgment? Okay, so it looks like the student is focusing on the location of where Michael Pollan spoke, right? And is making the point that the location shows the worth of this speech. And notice that point where he says, where the student writes, if Pollan had been speaking on a random street corner. So the student makes the point, hey, just the location of where Michael Pollan is speaking, it gives us or provides us with a basis for a judgment. Right, so a restaurant, right, you could say, well, the location of this restaurant adds value to it if you were doing a restaurant review, right? It's conveniently located by BART. Or if you were doing a music review, you might say, well, it's really easy to download this song for free, right? The location of the song is easily accessible. So notice that the location becomes one of the criterion that the student is using to make his judgment. Okay, so as you begin work on your own evaluations, you want to begin thinking about not only your judgment, not only your conclusion, right, your position, but also the criteria, right, the points, the expectations, the standards that you used in order to come to that judgment. And that will be very helpful when you're working on those body paragraphs. Thank you.